In 1934, a coal miner in Harlan County, Kentucky, fed 9 people on $1 a week. His wife owned 1 pot, 1 skillet, and 50 recipes she never once wrote down. Those meals are vanishing now. Number 41 kept a whole Dust Bowl town from starving. Number 7 fed the family that owned the land and the family that worked it off the very same pantry. And number 1 carried more Americans through hard times than any government check ever did. 50 states, 50 forgotten meals. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down. Number 50, Nevada boarding house stew. Out in the silver camps of Nevada, the men who came up out of the mines at the end of a shift did not want to talk and did not want to wait. They wanted a bowl put in front of them. In the Basque boarding houses of Elko and Winnemucca, the cook kept one enormous pot going all day long, and whatever came cheap went into it. A tough shoulder of mutton, a handful of dried beans, an onion, a few potatoes, water to the brim. It simmered from sunup, the meat surrendering slowly until it fell into threads, and the beans gave up their starch to thicken the broth into something you could stand a spoon in. Mutton was the cheapest meat in the state, maybe a dime a pound in 1910, because nobody back east wanted it. Out here, cooked long enough and salted right, it fed the men who dug the ore that built the fortunes they would never see. 1 pot, 15 hungry men, not a scrap left in the kettle. Number 49, Rhode Island Johnny Cakes. Before there was a United States, there was the Johnny Cake, and in Rhode Island they never stopped making it. The whole recipe was white cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and boiling water stirred into a thick batter, then dropped in spoonfuls onto a hot griddle greased with a little fat. That was it. No egg if you had none. No milk if the cow was dry. The cakes fried up crisp and golden at the edges and stayed soft and steaming in the middle, and you ate them with whatever you had, a smear of molasses, a bit of butter, a spoon of gravy, or nothing at all. Rhode Islanders will argue to this day about whether the cornmeal should be ground from flint corn and whether the cake should be thick or thin, but the poor cook never argued. She made them because cornmeal cost almost nothing and because 2 cups of it could feed the whole family standing around the stove. But a Johnny Cake off a hot griddle tastes like the first food this country ever made when it had almost nothing. Number 48, Connecticut Hasty Pudding. The name told you everything. It was hasty because it was quick, and it was pudding because that is what they called any thick boiled cereal in old New England. Cornmeal, water, salt. You stirred the meal into boiling water in a slow stream so it would not clump. Then you stood at the stove and stirred while it thickened and bubbled and spat like a little volcano. 20 minutes later, you had a pot of golden mush that stuck to your ribs and cost about 3 cents to make. Poured into a bowl with a well of milk in the center, or drizzled with molasses, or dark with a spoonful of maple syrup, it was breakfast and it was supper, and on the hardest weeks, it was both. Number 47, North Dakota, Keno-a-a-law soup. When the German-Russian families came down onto the northern plains, they brought a soup that could survive a Dakota winter, and Keno-la was it. Little pinched dumplings, nothing but flour, an egg, and a splash of milk or water worked into a stiff dough, then rolled into ropes and cut into pea-sized pieces with a knife. Those nofla dropped into a pot of simmering broth with diced potatoes and a little onion, and if there was cream to be had, a splash went in at the end to turn the whole thing pale and silky. The dumplings swelled as they cooked, dense and chewy, and each one carried the flavor of the broth into your spoon. A farm wife could make this from the cheapest things in the house on the coldest day of the year, and it would warm a table of children coming in from chores with red faces and frozen fingers. $1's worth of flour and potatoes fed the whole family, and left enough for the men's lunch pails. Number 46, Montana venison and barley stew. In Montana, a family that could shoot could eat, and a lot of families lived on what the men brought home from the fall hunt. A single deer or elk stretched across a whole winter, hung in the cold shed and cut down as needed, and the tougher cuts, the neck and the shanks, went into the stew pot. The venison browned in a little fat, then simmered for hours with a handful of pearl barley, an onion, a carrot if there was one, and salt. The barley was the secret. It cost almost nothing. It swelled to 3 times its size, and it thickened the broth into a hearty porridge that turned a few pounds of lean game into a meal that fed 8. The wild meat had a deep mineral richness that beef never had, and the long simmer took away any toughness the animal had earned running the ridges. Ranch families and homesteaders made this because a box of barley was a nickel and a deer was free if your aim was true. Number 45, Oregon smelt fry. Every spring, the smelt ran up the rivers of the Oregon coast so thick you could scoop them out with a bucket, and for a few weeks, the poorest family on the coast ate like it was a feast. These little silver fish, no longer than your finger, cost almost nothing when they were running, sometimes free if you had a dip net and a strong back. The cook rinsed them, rolled them whole in cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper, and dropped them into a skillet of hot fat until they turned crackling gold. You ate them whole, bones and all, hot off the pan with your fingers, and the tiny soft bones added a richness you never noticed. A wash tub of smelt could feed a whole coastal town, and the families who lived through the lean logging years remembered the smelt run the way other people remembered Christmas. Number 44, Wyoming chuckwagon beans. The cattle towns of Wyoming ran on beans, and the recipe never changed because it never needed to. A pot of pinto beans, soaked overnight, then set over a low fire with a chunk of salt pork, an onion, and a few dried chilies if the cook had them. Then it cooked, and cooked, sometimes all day, while the men worked the range until the beans went creamy and the pork fat melted into the broth and turned the whole pot a deep, smoky brown. A 100-pound sack of pintos cost a few dollars and fed a whole outfit for a month. There was nothing fancy about it, no measuring, no fuss, just beans and time and the patience to let them become something more than beans. First, pattern break. Here is where you start to see the shape of it. 50 states, and the same 6 or 7 ingredients keep coming back. Beans, cornmeal, potatoes, salt pork, an onion, water, a little grease saved in a can on the back of the stove. It did not matter if you were in a Nevada mining camp or a Dakota sod house. Poverty spoke the same language everywhere, and it spoke it in beans and cornmeal. Those are the foods that keep for months without a refrigerator, that fill a belly for pennies, that a woman with no money could turn into supper for a table of children. The rich ate differently in every region. The poor ate almost the same, coast to coast, because hunger does not care where you live. It only cares whether you can make something out of nothing, and these women could. Number 43, Alaska moose stew. In the Alaskan bush, the grocery store was the forest and the freezer was the whole outdoors. A family that took a moose in the fall had 600 or 700 pounds of meat to carry through a winter that could bury the cabin to the eaves. The tough cuts went into a stew that simmered for hours on the wood stove, the dark meat softening in a broth thick with potatoes, onions, and whatever root vegetables had come out of the short northern garden. There was no waste. The bones went in for their marrow, the scraps went in for their flavor, and the pot fed the family for days, reheated over and over as the cold pressed in against the windows. A moose cost a hunter a box of shells and a hard week of packing meat out on his back, and in return, it fed a family for half a year. Number 42. South Dakota chislic. Out on the South Dakota prairie, when a sheep or a steer was butchered, the tougher scraps did not go to waste. They became chislic, cubes of red meat, mutton most often, skewered or just dropped straight into a pan of hot grease and fried hard and fast until the outsides were dark and crisp and the insides stayed juicy. Salt was the only seasoning that mattered. You ate the cubes hot with your fingers, maybe with a few soda crackers on the side, and a plate of chislic could turn the cheapest cut on the animal into something the whole family fought over. For a farm family, chislic was how you honored the animal by eating even the parts nobody else wanted, and how you made a Saturday night feel like something when there was no money for anything store-bought. A pound of scrap mutton was next to nothing. Fried up hot and salted heavy, it tasted like a reward. Number 41, Oklahoma fried onion burger. This is the meal that a whole Dust Bowl town leaned on when the meat ran short and the wind carried the topsoil away. In the depths of the Depression, a butcher in El Reno, Oklahoma, figured out how to stretch a nickel's worth of ground beef into a full sandwich. You took a small ball of cheap ground beef, dropped it on a hot griddle, and piled a fistful of thin-sliced onions on top. Then you smashed the whole thing down flat with a spatula, pressing the onions right into the meat so a little beef and a lot of onion cooked together into one crisp, sweet, savory patty. The onions cost almost nothing and doubled the size of the burger, and as they caramelized, they made the cheap meat taste rich and beefy and deep. Slapped on a soft bun with a little mustard, it fed a hungry man for a few cents when a real hamburger was out of reach. Number 40. Maryland coddies. Baltimore was a poor man's town for a long time, and the coddy was a poor man's meal. Salt cod, the cheapest fish in the market because it kept forever in its box of salt, was soaked to soften it, then flaked and mixed with mashed potato, a little egg, and a cracker crumb to bind it. The mixture was patted into flat cakes, fried in a shallow pan of grease until golden, and sold two for a nickel at corner drugstores and lunch counters all over the city. You ate them the Baltimore way, pressed between two saltine crackers with a swipe of yellow mustard, standing up at the counter. It let a family eat fish on a Friday for the price of a few potatoes. Number 39. New Hampshire boiled dinner. In the hard New England winters, the boiled dinner was Sunday and Monday both. A cut of corned beef, the cheap cured brisket that a family could afford, went into a big pot of water and simmered low for the better part of a day. Then, in the last hour, everything the root cellar still held went in on top. Cabbage, potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onion, all of it boiling together in the salty, beefy broth until it was tender enough to cut with a fork. The genius was in the leftovers. Whatever corned beef and vegetables were left over from Sunday got chopped and fried the next morning into a hash, crisped in a skillet and topped with an egg. And that was Monday's dinner solved before Sunday's dishes were even dry. One cheap cut of beef and a cellar full of vegetables fed a family for 2 days with no waste at all. Number 38, Kansas beirochs. The Volga German families who settled the Kansas wheat country carried a recipe that was a whole meal folded up in bread. A beiroch was a soft yeast roll wrapped around a filling of ground beef, shredded cabbage, and onion, all cooked down together and seasoned with nothing but salt and pepper, then baked until the dough was golden and the filling steamed hot inside. The beauty of it was portability and thrift. A little meat went a long way once it was stretched with a whole head of cabbage, and the bread sealed the whole thing into a package a farmhand could carry into the fields and eat cold with one hand while the other held the plow, cabbage cost pennies and kept all winter in the cellar. A pound of ground beef, stretched through a dozen bieroks, fed a big family with meat to spare. Number 37, Colorado green chili. Down in the southern Colorado towns, where the Pueblo influence ran deep, green chili was the pot that never went empty. Not the thin sauce you get today, but a thick, stewy green chili built on a little cheap pork, a lot of roasted green chiles, an onion, a spoonful of flour to thicken it, and water. The pork was the cheap part, a few scraps or a bit of shoulder, cut small so it went far, and the chiles did the rest of the work. Roasted until their skins blistered and their flavor turned smoky and deep, they turned a thin pot of pork and water into something that made your whole face come alive. You ladled it over anything, a tortilla, a plate of beans, a fried egg in the morning, and every bowl was breakfast, lunch, or supper, depending on the hour. A sack of chiles bought cheap at the end of the harvest season could be roasted and frozen or dried and would flavor a family's pots all winter. Second pattern break. Notice what the chiles do, what the onions do, what the salt pork does. They are not the food. They are the flavor that makes the food bearable. A pot of plain beans will keep a body alive, but a body refuses it after a while. So the poorest cooks in America became the cleverest, because they had to make cheap taste good or watch their families stop eating. A blistered chile, a caramelized onion, a scrap of smoked pork, a spoonful of molasses. These were not luxuries. They were the tools that turned survival food into something a child came running for. Anybody can make food taste good with money. It takes a real cook to do it with nothing. Number 36, Washington oyster stew. It is hard to believe now, but there was a time when oysters were poor people's food, and nowhere more than the tide flats of Washington's coast. When the tide went out, the oysters were just lying there for the taking, free to anyone with a bucket and a strong back willing to bend for them. The cook shucked a mess of them, then made the simplest stew imaginable. A little butter or bacon fat in the pot, the oysters slipped in with their own briny liquor, a splash of milk to make it a stew, salt and pepper, and it was done the moment the edges of the oysters curled. You did not cook them long. You barely cooked them at all. Poured over a few broken crackers, a bowl of oyster stew was a rich, warm, briny supper that cost a coastal family nothing but the labor of gathering. Number 35, Arizona beans and tortillas. In the mining and ranching towns of Arizona, the meal that never failed was a pot of pinto beans and a stack of flour tortillas, and between the two of them, a family could eat like that for a lifetime. The beans, frijoles de la olla, simmered all day in a clay or iron pot with an onion, a bit of lard, and salt, until they were soft and swimming in a thick, savory broth the color of the desert at dusk. The tortillas were made by hand each day. Flour, lard, salt, and water worked into a dough, rolled thin, and cooked on a hot, dry griddle until they blistered and puffed. You did not need a fork. You tore a piece of tortilla, scooped up the beans, and ate. And when the beans ran low, you fried what was left with a little fat until they turned into refried beans and stretched into another meal. A pot of beans cost a few cents and fed a family for days. Number 34, Vermont red flannel hash. Nothing in a Vermont kitchen ever got thrown away, and red flannel hash was the proof. It started as the leftovers from a boiled dinner, the corned beef and the potatoes, and, most importantly, the beets, all chopped up fine together. Then it went into a hot cast iron skillet with a little fat, and it got pressed down and left alone until a deep brown crust formed on the bottom. The beets bled their color through the whole thing, turning the hash a startling red, which is where the name came from, red as a lumberjack's flannel shirt. You flipped it in chunks so the crust broke up and every bite had some of that crackling bottom. And you topped it with a fried egg if the hens were laying. It cost nothing because it was made entirely of food you had already paid for once. On a cold Vermont morning, with the maple woods frozen white outside, a plate of red flannel hash sent a man out to the sugar bush, warm and full. Number 33, Nebraska Runza. The Runza is Nebraska's own, and like the Kansas bierock, it came from the Volga German settlers, a soft bread pocket stuffed with seasoned ground beef, cabbage, and onion. But Nebraska made it so completely its own that the state practically runs on them. The dough was a rich, tender yeast bread rolled out and cut into squares, each one filled with a spoonful of the beef and cabbage mixture, then folded up into a sealed rectangle and baked until golden. The steam trapped inside kept the filling moist, and the cabbage cooked down sweet against the savory beef. For a farm family through the long Nebraska winters, a batch of runzas was a whole week of lunches, easy to grab, easy to carry, filling and cheap. A head of cabbage and a pound of beef made a dozen of them, and they reheated beautifully or ate fine cold. Number 32, Idaho sheepherders' beans. Up in the Idaho high country, the Basque sheepherders spent months alone with their flocks, and they ate out of one pot for weeks at a time. Their beans were a thing of quiet genius. A pot of red beans or pintos, set over a slow fire, with a piece of chorizo or a bit of salt pork, an onion, garlic, and sometimes a spoonful of tomato and paprika that turned the whole pot a rich, rusty red. The herder set it to cook in the morning, went out with the sheep, and came back at dusk to a pot that had done all its own work. The beans creamy, the broth deep and spiced, the sausage having given up all its smoke and fat to the pot. A herder lived on this and bread for months on the mountain, and it kept him strong through weather that would break most men. Number 31, New Jersey pasta e fagioli. In the Italian neighborhoods of Newark and Trenton and Jersey City, the immigrant families ate pasta e fagioli, pasta fazool, as everyone actually said it, and it was the meal that got them through the weeks when the pay envelope was thin. It was almost nothing. A can or two of beans, cannellini or borlotti, a small handful of whatever pasta was in the cupboard, a little tomato, an onion and garlic softened in olive oil, and water. It simmered until the pasta was tender, and the starch from the beans and the noodles thickened the whole pot into something between a soup and a stew. A grating of hard cheese on top, if there was a heel of it in the house, a drizzle of oil, and a family of 6 ate well for pennies. The beans gave it protein, the pasta gave it heft, and the tomato gave it the taste of home. Every Italian grandmother in New Jersey made it a little differently and swore hers was right. Number 30, Delaware scrapple. Down in the Delaware Valley, where the Pennsylvania Dutch settled, scrapple was born of a simple refusal to waste a single scrap of a butchered hog. When the pig was killed, the parts nobody would pay for, the trimmings, the organ meat, everything but the squeal, went into a pot and simmered until the meat fell apart. Then the broth and meat were thickened with cornmeal and a little buckwheat flour, seasoned hard with sage, thyme, and black pepper, and poured into loaf pans to set firm overnight in the cold. The next morning, you sliced the loaf a 1/4 inch thick and fried the slices in a dry hot pan until each side turned deep mahogany and crackling crisp, soft as custard inside. Served with eggs and a drizzle of syrup or a spoon of apple butter, it was the breakfast that launched farmers and factory men into their days. A loaf cost pennies to make and lasted a week. Third pattern break. Here is a hard truth. Almost every meal on this list was born from an animal that had to be used completely, or a harvest that could not be wasted, or a cut of meat nobody with money would touch. Scrapple, chislic, coddies, the tough shanks and the organ meats, and the salt-cured scraps. These families ate the whole animal not because a nutritionist told them to, but because throwing away food was a thing you simply could not do when there was not enough of it. And here is the part that should stop you. That instinct, born of pure necessity, turns out to have been right. The organ meats carried more nutrition than the fancy cuts the rich were eating. The bones they simmered gave up collagen and minerals people now pay good money for in a bottle. The whole animal, nothing wasted way of eating we abandoned the moment we could afford to was healthier than what replaced it. Our great-grandparents were not eating poor, they were eating smart. They just never had the luxury of calling it a choice. Number 29, Missouri fried cornmeal mush. In the Missouri Ozarks, cornmeal mush was supper one night and breakfast the next, and both times it cost almost nothing. The mush itself was just cornmeal boiled in salted water until it thickened into a smooth golden porridge, eaten hot with a little butter or a pour of molasses on the hardest nights. But the real magic came the next morning. Whatever mush was left had been poured into a loaf pan and left to set solid overnight in the cold pantry. You turned it out, sliced it thick, and fried the slices in bacon grease or lard until they were crisp and brown on the outside and creamy in the middle. Doused in sorghum syrup, fried mush was a breakfast that sent children off to a country school with something warm in their bellies. A sack of cornmeal cost a fraction of what wheat flour did, and it stretched further than anything else in the pantry. Number 28, Illinois haluski. In the Polish and Slovak neighborhoods of Chicago, where the men worked the stockyards and the steel mills, haluski was the meal that filled a family for the price of a cabbage. It could not have been simpler. A head of cabbage, sliced thin, cooked down slow in a lot of butter or bacon fat with an onion until it went soft and sweet and golden at the edges, almost caramelized. Then a pound of white egg noodles, boiled and drained, tossed right into the pan with the cabbage, salt, and plenty of black pepper, and that was the whole dinner. The cabbage gave up its sweetness, the noodles soaked up the fat, and the black pepper gave it just enough bite to keep it interesting. A head of cabbage cost a dime, and a bag of noodles not much more, and the pan fed a whole family with leftovers for the lunch pail. Number 27, Wisconsin booyah. Up in the Belgian and Walloon settlements around Green Bay, booyah was less a recipe than an event. It was a giant kettle stew, cooked outdoors in a pot big enough to bathe in, and it took all day and many hands. Into the enormous kettle went whatever cheap meat could be gathered, chicken backs, a bit of beef, an old stewing hen, along with a mountain of vegetables, onions, carrots, potatoes, cabbage, peas, beans, all of it simmering together for hours until the meat fell off the bones and the whole thing melted into a thick, rich, golden stew. Because it was made in such quantity, booyah was the food of church fundraisers and family reunions and whole neighborhood gatherings, a way to feed 100 people cheaply and joyfully at once. Everyone brought a little something to throw in the pot, and everyone left with a full belly. For poor communities, it was a genius solution to the problem of a celebration. How do you feed everyone when nobody has much? You pool it. You throw it all in one great kettle and let it simmer, and somehow the sum of everyone's scraps became a feast. Number 26, Maine fish chowder. On the cold coast of Maine, the fishermen brought home what they could not sell: the odd fish, the small ones, the ends of the catch, and the women turned it into chowder. A main fish chowder was a plain and holy thing. A bit of salt pork rendered in the pot, an onion softened in the fat, then diced potatoes and water simmered until the potatoes began to break down. Then chunks of white fish, haddock or cod or cusk, slipped in at the end and poached gently in the broth, followed by a good pour of milk or evaporated milk to make it creamy and pale. Salt, pepper, a knob of butter floating on top. That was it. No thickeners, no fuss, nothing to hide behind. The fish was cheap or free. The potatoes came from the garden, and a pot of chowder fed a fishing family through a raw, foggy evening for next to nothing. Number 25. Ohio Johnny Marzetti. In the kitchens of Columbus, Ohio, and across the whole state, Johnny Marzetti was the casserole that fed church suppers, school cafeterias, and big families on a budget for generations. The story goes it was named for the brother of a Columbus restaurant owner, but the dish belonged to everybody. It was a baked casserole of elbow macaroni, ground beef browned with onion, and a can of tomato sauce, all mixed together, topped with cheese if there was any, and baked until it was bubbling and the top went brown and crisp. A single pound of ground beef, stretched through a whole box of macaroni and a can of tomatoes, fed a dozen people, which is exactly why it turned up at every potluck and fundraiser in the state. Children loved it because it was warm and cheesy and mild. Mothers loved it because it was cheap and forgiving and could be made ahead and stretched to feed whoever showed up. It reheated for days and only got better. Number 24. New York Chicken Fricassee. In the crowded tenements of New York City, where the Jewish and immigrant families made do in tiny kitchens, chicken fricassee was how you made one chicken feed a whole family and taste like a holiday. Nothing was wasted, especially not the cheap parts, the wings, the necks, the gizzards, the feet, all the pieces the butcher practically gave away. They were browned in a pot, then simmered slow with onion and a little flour to thicken the liquid into a rich brown gravy. Often a few tiny meatballs went in too, made from a bit of ground meat stretched with breadcrumb, so the pot fed even more mouths. It cooked low and slow until the tough, cheap pieces went tender, and the gravy turned deep and savory, and it was served over rice or with bread to sop up every drop. A family that could not afford a roast could afford the parts nobody else wanted, and in the hands of a clever cook, those parts became a warm, brown, comforting supper. Number 23. Indiana Fried Bologna Sandwich. In Indiana, the fried bologna sandwich was not a joke, and it was not a snack. It was dinner, and a proud one. Every working family kept a ring or a chunk of bologna in the icebox because it cost so little and kept so long. The cook cut it thick, a good quarter-inch, and made a few small cuts around the edge so it would not curl up in the pan. Then it went into a hot cast-iron skillet and fried until the edges blistered and browned, and the middle domed up, filling the whole kitchen with a smell that brought the kids running. Slapped on soft white bread with a swipe of mustard and maybe a slice of cheese, hot and crisp and salty, it was a real meal, the kind a man ate after a long shift and a kid ate before school. Nobody was ashamed of a fried bologna sandwich in Indiana because everybody was eating them. A ring of bologna cost a few cents and fed a family for days. Fourth pattern break. Let us talk about what happened to all this. Every single one of these meals used to be normal, not nostalgic, not quaint, not a thing you saw on a menu with a clever name and a $12 price, just normal Tuesday supper in a normal house. And then, somewhere between the 1950s and now, the country got richer and the grocery stores got fuller. And a whole industry grew up whose entire business was convincing us that cooking from scratch was a burden we should be glad to be free of. Frozen dinners, canned everything, fast food on every corner. And it worked. We handed over the pot and the skillet and the knowledge that came with them, and we told ourselves we had traded up. But look at the trade. We gave away meals that cost pennies and fed a family, and bought back meals that cost dollars and fed us worse. We gave away the knowledge of how to make cheap food taste good, and now most people cannot feed themselves for a week on what these women fed a whole family for a week. That was not progress. That was a sale, and we were the thing being sold. Number 22, Massachusetts Boston baked beans. Boston was called Beantown for a reason, and the reason was survival. In old New England, Sunday was the Sabbath and no cooking was allowed, so the thrifty Puritan cook made a pot of beans on Saturday that would hold the family through to Monday. Dried navy beans went into a bean pot with a chunk of salt pork, a good pour of molasses, a spoon of mustard, and an onion, then baked low and slow in the oven or in a bean hole in the ground for 6 or 8 hours until the beans went soft and dark and swam in a thick, sweet, smoky syrup. The molasses was the New England touch, cheap and dark from the sugar trade, and it turned a plain pot of beans into something rich and deep and almost caramelized. A pound of dried beans cost a dime and fed the family for 2 or 3 days, served with brown bread steamed in a can. Number 21, Florida Cracker Swamp Cabbage. Long before Florida was beaches and theme parks, it was hardscrabble cracker country, and the poor families of the interior ate what the land gave them for free. One of the best things it gave was swamp cabbage, the tender heart of the sabal palm, the state tree. A man went into the palmetto scrub with an axe, felled a young cabbage palm, and cut out the pale, crisp heart at its center, pounds of it from a single tree, sliced up and stewed slow with a piece of salt pork or bacon, an onion, and a little water. That palm heart cooked down into something between a vegetable and a delicacy, mild and sweet and tender, tasting faintly of artichoke. It cost nothing but the labor of finding and felling the tree, and for a family living deep in the Florida woods, with no money and no store for miles, a pot of swamp cabbage was a green vegetable when there was no other to be had. Number 20, Iowa Loose Meat Sandwich. In Iowa, the loose meat sandwich, the tavern, the Maid-Rite, whatever the local name, was the working man's lunch for 100 years. It was ground beef, but not a burger. The beef was cooked loose, crumbled fine in the pan with a little onion and a bit of seasoning, kept moist and steamy, then spooned onto a soft hamburger bun so it spilled out the sides with every bite. You ate it with a pickle and a fork close at hand because it fell apart, and that was the whole charm of it. Because the meat was crumbled and stretched, a pound went further than it ever would as patties, and a diner could sell them cheap and still make a nickel. For families, it was the same math. A little ground beef, loosened and seasoned, fed more people than the same beef formed into burgers. Cafes and taverns all across Iowa built their reputations on their loose meat, and every town swore theirs was best. Number 19, Minnesota Hot Dish. In Minnesota, hot dish is not a casserole. Do not make that mistake. Hot dish is its own institution, and it kept Lutheran church basements and farm families fed through every long winter the North could throw at them. The formula was sacred in its thrift. A starch, a protein, a can of cream soup, and something crunchy on top, all baked together in one dish. The classic was ground beef, tater tots, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and maybe a handful of frozen vegetables, layered up and baked until the tots went golden and the whole thing bubbled at the edges. It cost almost nothing. It made itself once it was in the oven, and it fed a big family or a whole potluck out of one pan. The cream soup was the secret binder that made everything creamy and familiar and turned a pound of cheap beef into a full meal. Every family had their version. Every funeral and every fundraiser had a table full of them, and every Minnesotan can still taste the one their grandmother made. Number 18, Michigan pasty. Up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in the copper and iron country, the pasty fed the miners and their families for generations, and it came over from the tin mines of Cornwall, along with the men who dug the ore. A pasty was a whole meal sealed inside a sturdy crust, a half-moon of pastry folded around a filling of diced potato, rutabaga, onion, and a little cheap beef, all raw when it went in and cooking together inside the sealed crust in the oven. The genius was that it was a lunch a miner could carry a mile underground in his pocket, still warm hours later, eaten with dirty hands by holding the thick crimped edge, which he threw away because his fingers had touched it. The vegetables were cheap and filling, the meat was stretched thin, and the crust sealed in the heat and the flavor. A Cornish and Finnish mining wife made a batch of pasties that fed her husband's whole shift, and the meal became so deeply Michigan that the UP still runs on pasties today. Number 17, Pennsylvania Dutch chicken pot pie. This is not the pot pie you are picturing. There is no crust, no oven, no golden top. Pennsylvania Dutch pot pie, bot boy, is a stew, and it fed the German farm families of Pennsylvania through every hard season for 200 years. An old stewing hen, too tough and too old to do anything else with, was simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bones and the broth turned rich and golden. Then, squares of rolled-out noodle dough, thick and slippery, were dropped into the boiling broth, along with cubes of potato, and they cooked up soft and dumpling-like, thickening the whole pot into a hearty, savory stew. It was cheap because it used the animal nobody else wanted and stretched it with dough and potato that cost almost nothing. A single tough old hen, which a farm family would otherwise have no use for, became a pot of pot pie that fed everyone at the table, with the broth doing half the work. Number 16, North Carolina liver mush. In the western part of North Carolina, liver mush was breakfast, and it was as cheap and honest as food gets. Like scrapple, it was born from the hog butchering and the refusal to waste a thing. Pork liver and scraps of pork head meat were cooked and ground, then mixed with cornmeal and seasoned hard with sage and black pepper and pressed into a loaf to set. You sliced it, fried the slices in a hot pan until the outside was crisp and brown, and ate it with eggs or on a biscuit or with a little syrup, and it filled a working man up for pennies. The liver made it rich and iron-heavy and nourishing, exactly the kind of cheap nutrition a hard-laboring family needed, and the cornmeal stretched it further still. In the Carolina foothills, liver mush was so beloved that towns still hold festivals for it. But it started as pure necessity, a way to turn the cheapest, most perishable parts of a hog into a loaf that fed a family for a week of breakfasts. Fifth pattern break. You have heard me say it a dozen times now, that these meals were cheap, that they stretched, that they fed a family for pennies. But I want you to really sit with what that meant, because it was not just about money. When a mother could turn a dime's worth of beans and a scrap of pork into a supper that filled every child at her table, she was doing something that a bank account could not measure. She was keeping her family together. She was keeping the shame away. She was making sure that when her children looked back on those hard years, they remembered the smell of cornbread and the warmth of a full bowl, not the ache of going without. That is why these recipes got passed down, whispered from mother to daughter, penciled into the margins of church cookbooks. They were not just instructions for making food. They were instructions for surviving with your dignity intact and for making your children feel rich when the money said you were poor. Number 15, Arkansas, chocolate gravy and biscuits. Down in the Arkansas Ozarks, there was a breakfast so simple and so beloved that people who grew up on it will get misty-eyed just hearing the name, chocolate gravy. It sounds like a dessert, but it was Sunday morning in a poor mountain home. The cook stirred together cocoa powder, sugar, a little flour, and water or milk in a skillet and cooked it, whisking, until it thickened into a glossy, dark, pudding-like gravy. Then she poured it hot over split, buttered biscuits, and that was breakfast, sweet and warm and rich for a family that could not dream of store-bought pastries. Cocoa and sugar and flour cost almost nothing, and a batch of chocolate gravy turned a plate of plain biscuits into a treat that children remembered their whole lives. Number 14, Utah funeral potatoes. In Utah, in the Mormon communities, there was one dish that showed up at every funeral, every church gathering, every time a family needed feeding in a hard hour, and everyone just called them funeral potatoes. It was a casserole built entirely from cheap, shelf-stable pantry things, exactly what a community that believed in keeping a full food storage always had on hand. Shredded or diced potatoes, a can of cream soup, a little cheese, sour cream if there was any, all mixed together and topped with something crunchy, crushed cornflakes or crackers with a little butter, then baked until it was golden and bubbling. It cost almost nothing to make. It could be assembled from a cellar shelf without a trip to the store, and it fed a whole crowd of grieving neighbors out of one big pan. Number 13, South Carolina chicken bog. In the low country of South Carolina, chicken bog was the dish that fed big gatherings and hungry families cheaply and gloriously. It was a one-pot meal of chicken, rice, and sausage, cooked all together until the rice absorbed every drop of the flavor. A whole chicken, or the cheap parts of one, was simmered down in a big pot until the meat fell off the bone. Then the meat was pulled and returned to the pot, along with a good bit of smoked sausage cut into coins and plenty of rice. The rice cooked right in the chicken broth, soaking up all that fat and flavor until it was tender and rich and slightly wet, which is where the name came from, bog, because the rice was boggy, not dry. It was the food of church suppers and family reunions and community fundraisers all across the PD region, cooked in cast iron pots big enough to feed 100. Number 12, Texas chili con carne. Before chili was a contest with rules and trophies, it was the cheap, spicy stew that fed the poor of San Antonio. The famous chili queens sold it from open-air stands in the plaza, ladling out bowls of red to laborers and cowboys and anyone with a few cents in their pocket. Real Texas chili had almost no beans in it and no tomatoes to speak of, just cheap beef, the tough scraps, cut small and stewed slow with dried red chilies, garlic, cumin, and salt until the meat went tender and the chilies thickened the whole pot into a deep, dark, fiery red. The chilies did more than flavor it. They helped preserve the cheap meat in the days before good refrigeration, and they masked any off taste a scrap of beef might carry. A bowl of red with a stack of tortillas or a hunk of bread was a full, warming, fiery meal for pennies, and it could simmer for hours, getting better the whole time. It fed the working poor of Texas, Mexican and Anglo alike, out of the cheapest cuts and the cheapest peppers. Number 11, Georgia cane syrup and biscuits. In rural Georgia, on the poorest farms, there was a supper so simple it barely counts as a recipe, and yet it fed countless children and stayed in their hearts forever. Biscuits and cane syrup. The family grew sugarcane and, at grinding time in the fall, boiled the juice down in a big open kettle into thick, dark, golden cane syrup, jars and jars of it to last the year. And on the nights when there was nothing else, the mother made a pan of biscuits from flour, lard, and buttermilk, and the children sopped them in a puddle of that syrup poured onto their plates. That was supper. Sopping syrup, they called it, and there was an art to it, dragging the torn biscuit through the syrup to soak up just enough without making a mess. The cane cost nothing but the labor of growing and grinding it, and a pan of biscuits was pennies of flour. It was the barest of meals, bread and sweetness, but on a Georgia farm where money never came and the land gave what little it could. A plate of biscuits and cane syrup was warm and filling, and to a child who knew no different, absolutely wonderful. Number 10. New Mexico pozole. In New Mexico, pozole was the pot that meant both survival and celebration, and it stretched a little pork into a feast. It started with dried hominy, field corn treated with lime until the kernels swelled and softened, which cost almost nothing and swelled to many times its size in the pot. To the hominy went a little cheap pork, the cheaper cuts cut small, along with red or green chile, garlic, and oregano, and the whole thing simmered for hours until the hominy burst open and turned tender and the pork fell apart and the broth ran deep with the flavor of the chile. The corn was the point, filling and cheap and endlessly stretchable, so that a small amount of pork fed a whole crowd. Pozole was made for the holidays and for hard times alike, a great pot of it feeding an extended family through Christmas or through a lean February with equal generosity. For a poor family, it was the perfect food, a handful of dried corn and a scrap of pork turned by time and chile into something that tasted like abundance. Number 9. Virginia Brunswick stew. Brunswick stew came out of the Virginia backcountry, and it began as a hunter's stew made from whatever small game the men brought home: squirrel, rabbit, whatever the woods provided. Over time, it became a great communal pot, thick with cheap meat and a jumble of vegetables, simmered so long that everything melted together into a stew you could almost stand a spoon in. The meat, whether game or later cheap chicken and pork, was cooked until it shredded and disappeared into the pour, and to it went corn, lima beans, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, all the cheap garden vegetables, cooked down for hours over a low fire until the whole thing turned into a thick, rich, savory mass. It was the food of hunt clubs and church grounds and political rallies, cooked outdoors in enormous kettles and stirred with a boat paddle, feeding whole communities cheaply from a little meat and a lot of vegetables. For a poor family, it was a way to turn a couple of squirrels or a cheap old hen into a meal that fed everyone for days. Number 8. Louisiana red beans and rice. In Louisiana, Monday was wash day, and wash day was red beans and rice, because it was the meal a woman could set on the back of the stove in the morning and forget about while she spent the whole day at the wash tub. A pound of dried red kidney beans, soaked overnight, went into the pot with the leftover ham bone from Sunday's dinner, a smoked sausage or a bit of tasso, and the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper. Then it simmered low and slow for hours, unattended, while the beans slowly broke down and turned creamy, and the pork gave up all its smoke and fat to the pot, until the whole thing thickened into a rich, savory gravy. Served over a mound of white rice, it was cheap, filling, and so deeply flavored that nobody could believe it cost so little. A bag of beans and a leftover bone fed a family for days. Louis Armstrong loved it so much, he signed his letters, "Red beans and ricely yours," and he meant it, because that was the taste of home for a poor New Orleans boy. It was Monday's supper, born of a wash day and a leftover bone, and it became one of the greatest cheap meals America ever made. Number 7. Hawaii Spam Musubi. When the war came to the Pacific, fresh meat vanished from the islands and canned spam took its place, cheap, shelf-stable, and available when nothing else was. The people of Hawaii did not just tolerate it, they made it their own, and the spam musubi became the island's beloved cheap meal. A slice of spam was fried until the edges caramelized, then laid on a block of hot rice and wrapped with a strip of dried seaweed into a neat little handheld package like sushi but built for a lunch pail. It cost almost nothing, it kept without refrigeration for hours, and it was filling enough to power a plantation worker through a long day in the cane fields or the pineapple rows. The salty, fried spam against the plain, warm rice was somehow perfect, and it became the food of every beach, every convenience store, every school lunch across the islands. It was born of rationing and poverty, a way to make a cheap can of mystery meat into a satisfying meal, and the people of Hawaii loved it so completely that it outlasted every hard time that created it. To this day, it is the taste of the islands, cheap and humble and beloved, poverty food that became a point of pride. Number 6. California Cioppino. Out on the wharves of San Francisco, the Italian and Portuguese fishermen ate what they could not sell. At the end of a long day, whatever was left in the bottom of the boat, the odd crab, the small fish, the mussels and clams nobody bought, the broken pieces, all of it went into a communal pot on the dock. The men each threw in what they had, chipped in, which some say is where the name came from, and it all simmered together in a broth of tomatoes, garlic, wine, and olive oil into a rich, briny seafood stew. It cost the fishermen nothing but the scraps of their own unsold catch, and it fed the whole crew a feast at the end of a hard, cold day on the water. Sopped up with a hunk of the crusty sourdough that the city was famous for, cioppino was a poor fisherman's supper that happened to be one of the most glorious things anyone ever cooked. Number 5. Alabama tomato gravy over biscuits. In the poor farmhouses of Alabama, tomato gravy over biscuits was the breakfast that got a family up and into the fields, and it cost almost nothing. It started with a spoon of bacon grease in the cast iron skillet, saved from the morning's few precious slices. Into the grease went a spoonful of flour, cooked and stirred until it turned the color of a paper bag, and then a can of tomatoes crushed up by hand, poured right in with a little water and a pinch of sugar and salt. It bubbled and thickened into a bright, tangy, savory red gravy, and it was poured hot and generous over a pan of split buttermilk biscuits. The tomatoes came from the summer garden, put up in jars, and the biscuits were made from the flour and lard that every southern pantry kept in a 50-pound bag. That acid brightness of the tomato cut right through the rich lard biscuit underneath, and it turned a plate of plain bread into a real breakfast. For a family with a garden and a little flour, tomato gravy meant no one went to work on an empty stomach. It has all but vanished now, sopped up and forgotten, a bright red memory of a southern morning. Number 4. Mississippi Delta, hot tamales. Deep in the Mississippi Delta, in the poorest, flattest, hardest cotton country in America, there grew up a strange and wonderful thing, the hot tamale, made by black families and sold from carts and stands along dusty roads for generations. Nobody is entirely sure how tamales came to the Delta, whether from migrant Mexican field workers or some older exchange, but the Delta made them completely its own. Unlike their cousins to the west, Delta tamales were small and simmered, not steamed. Cornmeal rolled around a bit of heavily spiced cheap ground meat, wrapped in a corn husk, and simmered in a spicy, greasy, red-tinged broth until they were hot and tender. A little cheap meat, spiced hard and stretched through a lot of cornmeal, fed a family or sold 3 for a quarter to workers coming out of the fields. They were cheap to make, filling and spicy enough to make a plain supper feel like an event. For poor Delta families, both making them to sell and eating them, hot tamales were a small economy and a great comfort at once. Number 3, Tennessee cornbread and buttermilk. This is the one that people are almost ashamed to admit they loved, because it was the meal of the very end of the money, and yet it is the one they miss the most. In the hills of Tennessee, when the week was longer than the paycheck and there was nothing left to cook, the mother crumbled a piece of leftover cornbread into a tall glass of cold buttermilk and handed it over with a spoon. That was supper. The cornbread, made from cornmeal and a little buttermilk and baked in the black skillet, soaked up the tangy cold milk and softened, and you ate it with a spoon like a cold, savory porridge, and somehow it was good. It cost almost nothing, a little cornmeal and the buttermilk left over from churning, and it filled an empty stomach and settled a hungry child down for the night. Grown men who left those hills and made good money still crumble cornbread into buttermilk on quiet nights because it tastes like their childhood and their mother and the specific tender poverty of a home that had love if it had nothing else. It was the poorest supper on the poorest nights, and it is the one that lived on longest in the hearts of the people who survived on it. Number 2, West Virginia pepperoni roll. Down in the coal country of West Virginia, the pepperoni roll was invented for one purpose: to feed a miner in the dark. An Italian immigrant baker in Fairmont figured out that if you baked sticks of pepperoni right into a soft roll of bread, the grease and flavor of the meat soaked into the dough as it baked, and you had a lunch that needed no refrigeration, no reheating, and no plate. A miner could carry a couple of pepperoni rolls a mile underground in his lunch bucket, and hours later, in the dark, cold, and hungry, he could eat them with black hands and get everything he needed: meat, bread, salt, and fat in one cheap package. It cost the baker almost nothing, a little cheap pepperoni and a lot of bread, and it became the food that fed the men who dug the coal that lit the country. Every family in the coal fields knew how to make them, and every bakery and gas station in the state still sells them. It was immigrant ingenuity meeting the brutal need of the mines, and it produced the one food West Virginia claims above all others: a humble roll of bread and pepperoni that carried a man through his shift and a whole state through its hardest century. Number 1, Kentucky soup beans and cornbread. And at the very top, the meal that held up more of Appalachia than any other, the meal that fed the coal camps and the hill farms and the hollows of eastern Kentucky through every hard winter and every lean year and every strike and layoff that mountain country ever suffered. Soup beans and cornbread, a pot of dried pinto beans soaked overnight, then simmered slow all day with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock, an onion, and nothing else but salt and pepper and thyme. By supper, the beans had broken down at the edges and thickened their own broth into a rich, dark, soupy liquor that tasted of the pork and the beans and the long, patient hours. Beside it, a wedge of cast-iron cornbread, and you crumbled the cornbread right into the beans and ate from a single bowl, and you sliced a raw onion to eat on the side. A pound of beans cost a dime, and the ham hock was a scrap the butcher nearly gave away, and that one pot fed a family of 8 for 2 days. This was not a side dish in Kentucky. This was the meal, 5 and 6 nights a week, for families who worked the mines and asked for nothing fancy because they had never known it. It built generations, men and women who came up strong on beans and cornbread and pot liquor and never once felt poor at their own table. It is the meal we should remember longest because it kept the most people alive on the least money with the most dignity. Your grandmother knew it by heart. She never wrote it down. She never had to. Here is the challenge. Pick the one from your state or your grandmother's state and make it this week. The soup beans, the pepperoni roll, the cornbread and buttermilk, the tomato gravy. Then come back and tell me if it tasted like what you remember. Because these were never just cheap meals. They were 50 different states finding 50 different ways to say the same thing. That a family could go without money and still not go without love or dinner or dignity. Drop your state in the comments. I want to know whose grandmother made it best.